Today, we are at the last lesson studying the Constitution of the United States. We're doing Amendments 26 and 27. Congratulations on getting through this long process. And thank you so much for having a deeper dive and more understanding in our U.S. Constitution, our founding document that holds our nation together and we need to respect. All right, today we're going to talk first about Amendment 26. And I have to start with telling you a personal story. So, this amendment came as a result of the Vietnam War, really. In those days, I was growing up. I was born in the era of the Vietnam War, and I can remember being in middle school and all the boys in our class sitting around and talking about what it was going to be like when they got drafted, when they had to go serve in a war they didn't understand. And, you're 12, 13 years old and knowing this is your future and you don't know how much time you have left on earth. So these are serious and scary conversations for young people. Also, during that era, when my brother in law was about 20, 21 years old, he had become overwhelmed in college and dropped out and was immediately drafted and sent to Vietnam during the height of the Tet Offensive, which, if you know much history, that was one of the heights of the Vietnam War. And my husband, in trying to prevent his brother from being sent to Vietnam, since only one brother these days could be sent to the war itself, tried to head it off by joining the Air Force and volunteering for Vietnam, but his brother was already there by the time he got his orders. So both of these guys were, like 19 and 20, 21 years old and serving their country like so many American young men in a war that was confusing. So in order to understand now the amendment, I'm going to give you a little history lesson. And I know sometimes history lessons can be a little bit like, oh, but this is an important one, so bear with me. So the conflict in Vietnam went all the way back to 1945. And it was between communist Vietnamese forces and the French colonial government that was running Vietnam at the time. In 1954, the communist troops under Ho Chi Minh defeated the colonial French. So they signed a peace treaty that effectively split the country into North Vietnam, which would be communist, and South Vietnam, which would remain loyal to the West. And it was led by Emperor Bao Dai. In 1955, Emperor Bao Dai was ousted by a very strongly anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem. So I'm massacring these Vietnamese names. I apologize. So in the West at the same time, the Cold War was raging. And for young people who don't have much exposure to that era, the Cold War felt to those of us in those days very serious. So there wasn't like active shooting going between the United States and our biggest Cold War enemy, which was Russia. Instead, it was a war for who was going to control the world. So the communists were actively colonizing new nations, the post-World War II nations in Eastern Europe, and then in Latin America and South America. And the U.S. was actively trying to head that off at the pass and trying to enable installing pro-Western governments in any country it could, especially in the Western Hemisphere. So there was all kind of backstory and drama going on. In 1955, President Eisenhower pledged support for the South Vietnamese government, so started sending military equipment and trainers and agents from the CIA to help. So this is 1955. In 1955, the government under Diem was not popular. He had cracked down on anybody he was concerned might be a communist sympathizer. So he would arrest them, and torture and execution was happening. As many as 100,000 South Vietnamese were arrested under his government. Then in 1961, President Kennedy sent a fact-finding team to South Vietnam to check on progress. How is the conflict going? Because there's still conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam going on. That fact-finding team suggested a buildup of aid from the United States, including military personnel, equipment, and technology. They feared in those days what they called the domino theory. So everybody talked about that in those days. If Vietnam fell, then Laos would fall, then Cambodia would fall, and everybody would be falling into communism. And so then the communists would win the Cold War. All right, so in 1963, a military coup killed Diem and installed its own leader in South Vietnam. And that was 3 weeks before President Kennedy was assassinated. So President Johnson takes the reins and tries to stabilize the South Vietnamese government by sending more troops. So this is 1963. So we had been helping out for almost a decade at that point. In 1964, 2 U.S. destroyers were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and this made Congress ticked off. And so they gave President Johnson powers to conduct war. Although it was never a declared war, it was always officially the Vietnam conflict, although everybody calls it the Vietnam War, just not on the books. All right. So this is 10 years of being involved in military conflict in some form or the other. And now it is spiraling into more and more involvement with the US. All right. So in order to help out, the US began a bombing expedition and decided to just bomb the tar out of the Vietnamese from the north, trying to head off any extra supplies coming from Laos or any other country to help out the North Vietnamese, and trying to cut them off from the south. So just bombing everything. And that was what they decided seemed the wise thing to do. By 1965, 100,000 troops from America, from the United States, were in Vietnam. And then the next year, another 100,000. So there's 200,000 American troops engaged in a non-declared war in Vietnam. By 1967, and this is when I was, a young person, so early middle school, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Over 15,000 young people had been killed. 109,000 plus had been wounded and or were experiencing PTSD or came back with drug addiction, which was very common. And there were desertions happening very frequently. So, rather than just slow things down and say, this isn't going anywhere, it's just getting more and more. Instead, in 1969, the government started the draft lottery. So each American male at age 18 had to register for the draft and was assigned a number. That law is still on the books, by the way, that 18-year-olds for males have to register for the draft, although the draft is not being used right now. All right, so if their draft number was called on a lottery day, they had to go serve. They were immediately drafted into the U.S. Army. Over 2 million young men between the ages of 18 and 21 were drafted by 1972. 2 million young men. Okay. All right. Now, in contrast to 2 million young people being drafted into the US Army and being sent to Vietnam, those who were wealthy, who could afford college, because these days there wasn't much subsidized college, you had to have a way to pay for college. So if you had parents that were wealthy enough to help you with college, you could stay in college and avoid the draft. So anybody who was of wealth stayed in college, or if they didn't want to do that, they got a medical waiver. So if you had some kind of a medical condition like bone spurs, you could avoid being drafted. Some young men registered as conscientious objectors. And so while they had to serve, they could serve working in a hospital rather than actual conflict. So essentially, what you had then were 18 to 21 year olds were essentially, if you were male, you were graduating high school and pretty much going into a war that nobody understood. Nobody knew why we were fighting. They just knew that we were fighting. Like, it was hard to understand a domino theory if you're a young person. And so they knew also with the high, um, you know, numbers of young people being wounded and killed, that they could be giving their lives away to a cause that they didn't understand. And not one of these young people could vote about it. They couldn't vote to vote out one of their legislators or the president who were, causing these things to happen and threaten their lives. So the saying was, you can fight, but you can't vote, or they can take a bullet, but not a ballot. And actually, those two phrases actually go back to World War II, where people were concerned about that, but there was a cause, and so they set it aside. There's a cause everyone understood in those days. Vietnam did not have a cause people understood. The Vietnam War was not popular. And these young people going right from high school right into military service, and a lot of them dying or being injured, was not popular. But because they couldn't vote, young people started protesting. And the college campuses took up the protests. And so they were protesting regularly on college campuses, marches, and they were giving speeches using their First Amendment rights to, peaceful assembly and trying to get their grievances addressed. So it was called in those days student unrest. And so Congress people started being very concerned about this. They had just recently, like this is by 1969, 1970, 1972, there's all this unrest, like messes. They had recently just finished or slowed down the civil rights activism with the Voting Rights Acts and those kind of bills that had given the Black voters in America the chance to vote. But these young people had no voice. And so the legislators started being concerned. How are we going to settle these students down? How are we going to keep the country from erupting? So even President Nixon says, hey, you know what? We do need to do something. I think we need to let the 18-year-olds vote. So they did not feel, neither the president nor the Congress felt that just adding the 18-year-olds to the Civil Rights Acts that had been passed, that legislation was going to solve the problem, because things would go to court and it would be all tied up in court. So they decided the only thing to do was to pass a constitutional amendment. And so in March of 1971, so I was a young person in those days. I was in ninth grade. Congress agreed unanimously, both sides. It's a bipartisan bill, unanimously. The Senate and the House of Representatives both approved the 26th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. And then just 4 months later, it was ratified. Like states were just churning that thing through. It was the shortest time for ratification of any amendment. It was just like the country was united. We need to give these young people, if they're going to fight in a war, they need the right to vote. So this amendment was so popular and so agreed upon across the board, that it spent very little time in court. There were a few court cases in some states that were worried, with having so many young people starting to vote, that they would swing the balance of power from the institutional parties to more independent, or away from the Republicans toward the Democrats, because at that time there's a Republican president, although the war was escalated under Democrats, but it was a mess. But that didn't go anywhere. And the 18-year-old vote was protected. So sometimes they call it the Forgotten Amendment because it spent so little time being addressed in courts. Like it was just everybody says, yes, we want to do this. All right. However, recently, there was a word in the amendment that says abridged. Now I'm going to read the amendment to you. So Amendment 26. It says the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. And then Section 2 gives Congress the power to enforce the article by appropriate legislation. All right, so recently there's been a little bit of noise about the word abridged, because every once in a while a state will try to say students who are away at college need to return home, even if they're out of state, and vote in person in order for their vote to count. And so, the students say, you're abridging my right to vote. So that is the major noise that has come up with that. Okay, now let's talk about Amendment 27. All right, so this is a fun one. So the Amendment 26 was the shortest amount of time for any amendment to be proposed and ratified. Amendment 27, on the other hand, is the longest time for any amendment to be proposed and ratified. So the backstory on that is back in 1789, James Madison proposed the first 12 amendments to the Constitution. So the first 10 were accepted and ratified, and we know those as the Bill of Rights. There were 2 leftovers. I don't even know what the other one is, but one was a rule that said if Congress gives themselves a raise, it cannot go into effect until after the next election. And his purpose in that was that he wanted to make sure that Congress was not enriching itself, to the detriment of the tax-paying population or the normal Americans. And there was some back and forth about that in those days. Like Benjamin Franklin thought that people in Congress shouldn't even be paid at all. And then, that was shot down because they were afraid then that only wealthy people would be able to serve. So things were just kind of muddled. And then, the amendment was proposed. It was okayed by Congress, but only 6 states had ratified it. And then it just got forgotten, just like everybody got busy doing other things. And that was the end of that. That is until 1982. So it's proposed in 1789. And in 1982, a sophomore at the University of Texas named Gregory Watson wrote a paper. And in that paper, he suggested that the amendment could still be ratified and made the 27th Amendment because James Madison had not put a time limit on the ratification process for that amendment. So in those days, they often did not put time limits. Sometimes they do now when the amendments are proposed, but Madison had not. So there was no officially stated time limit on that amendment being ratified. So his teacher did not like the paper, didn't approve of his argument, and gave him a C on his paper. And Watson, debated with the TA first and then his teacher, and the C held, and he said, oh, okay. All right, I have a bee in my bonnet now. And he decided to prove his point that he was right. And he took on a one-man campaign. And he wrote to every state that had not yet ratified. Remember, only 6 had ratified it. 1 extra came on, so there were 7 at that time. But all these other states had not ratified it. And he wrote the legislators, the state legislature in each of those states, and proposed that amendment should be ratified. So a lot of times, people go, isn't that interesting, threw it in the trash. However, in 1983, so a year later, Maine's Senator William Cohen said, you know what, this is a good idea. Let's make this a cause. And, at that time, it was one of those time periods where people were going like, the government just is looking out for itself. And so he was saying, no, look, we're going to make this amendment. So he starts campaigning along with Gregory Watson. And finally, in 1992, 10 years after he got the C on his paper, the required 3/4 of the states had ratified, and it had become the 27th Amendment. And it says, all right, no law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. So they can give themselves a raise, but it won't take in effect until after the next election, in case it makes everybody mad and they vote them out of office. So people still have a voice. So it was proposed in 1789 and ratified in 1992. It's over 200 years between the proposal and the ratification. So that was the longest time. And it is also the most recent amendment of the United States Constitution. So don't forget the power of one person. Over and over we see one person who believes in something often makes a difference. So hold on to that. Hold on to the importance of our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, of our equality, and the things that make our nation great. And those are in our founding documents. Stand up for the Constitution. And if you have something that wanted to be addressed, you've got your First Amendment. Go for it.